The man stopped before the gaunt figure on the edge of the street. A heavy drizzle was falling, and the musty smell from the woman's threadbare coat mingled with the acrid scent of wet asphalt. He had only intended to give her a few dollars, but her eyes, a mix of exhaustion and a flicker of gratitude, made him pause. His empty house was just 3 blocks away. No one was there. No one was waiting. He invited her home. That night he heard soft footsteps in the kitchen. The faint aroma of freshly brewed tea wafted through the rooms, but the cup placed on the table remained untouched. From that moment, a strange and unsettling feeling began to grow inside him, something he couldn't name, and he did not yet know that the truth hidden behind her quiet thank you would eventually break his heart. The rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers did little to cut through the gray curtain of rain that had draped itself over the city for 3 consecutive days. For Arthur Pendleton, the sound was a familiar metronome marking the quiet passage of his life, a steady beat against the silence that had taken up residence in his home since Martha passed 2 years ago. The streets glistened under the halo of the streetlights, reflecting the melancholy mood of the evening. He was driving home from the small accounting firm he had run for over 40 years, a place of numbers and order that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic grief that sometimes ambushed him in the stillness of his house. It was in that house, a place once filled with laughter and the scent of Martha's baking, that the silence was most profound. Tonight it felt particularly heavy, pressing in on him with the weight of the storm outside. It was then that he saw her, a fragile silhouette huddled in the recessed doorway of a closed-down bookstore. She was a watercolor painting left out in the storm, her features blurred by the downpour, her form cloaked in a coat the color of ash. Other cars sped past, their headlights catching the spray from their tires, but Arthur slowed his sedan to a crawl. He was not a man given to grand gestures. His life was one of quiet routine and measured kindnesses. A generous tip for the waitress at the diner, a bag of groceries left on the porch of an elderly neighbor, a donation to the local library. This, however, felt different. It was the way she held herself, not with the aggressive despair of some, but with a defeated stillness, as if she were trying to become one with the shadows. He pulled over to the curb, the engine humming a low, steady tune. He rolled down the passenger side window, letting the damp, cool air into the warmth of the car. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice feeling rusty from a day of disuse. The woman flinched, pulling her thin coat tighter around her shoulders before slowly turning her head. In the dim light, he could see a face etched with lines of hardship, but it was her eyes that held him. They weren't empty. They were exhausted, wells of a story he couldn't begin to guess. He held out a $20 bill. "Please, take this. Get yourself something warm." She took a hesitant step forward, her gaze fixed on the money, then lifting to meet his. A flicker of something, pride, perhaps, or just profound weariness, crossed her face before she gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. As her thin, cold fingers brushed against his, a sudden, impulsive thought took hold of him. The guest room upstairs, with its clean sheets and quiet view of the garden, had been empty for 2 years. The silence in his house was a choice, but tonight it felt like a sickness. "I have a warm room," he heard himself say, the words surprising even him. "And a hot meal. It's not far from here. No questions asked." The woman stared at him, her expression shifting from tired gratitude to deep suspicion. The world was not kind to people in her position, and an offer like this was more often a trap than a miracle. Arthur understood. He kept his expression open, his hands visible on the steering wheel. "My name is Arthur. I live alone. It's just too miserable a night for anyone to be out in this." He waited, letting the silence stretch, punctuated only by the drumming of the rain on the car roof. Finally, after a long moment that felt like an entire conversation had passed between them, she gave another slow nod. She walked around the car and quietly opened the passenger door, sinking into the seat with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime. The only thing she brought with her was a tattered canvas bag, which she clutched to her chest as if it contained all the world's treasures. Its zipper was broken, the metal teeth mangled, and a length of rough twine held its contents precariously inside. The drive to his house on Maple Street was short and silent. He pointed out landmarks, the library, the park, in a quiet attempt to fill the void, and she simply nodded, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. When he pulled into the driveway of his modest two-story home, he could feel her hesitation. He turned off the engine, and the silence rushed back in, now shared between two strangers. "Here we are," he said gently. He led her inside, the warmth of the house a stark contrast to the damp chill clinging to her clothes. He showed her to the guest room, provided her with a set of Martha's old, soft pajamas and fresh towels, and told her to take her time. While she showered, he prepared a simple soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, the familiar actions a comfort in the unfamiliar situation. He tried not to think about what he was doing, about the potential dangers, the sheer foolishness of bringing a complete stranger into his home. Instead, he focused on the simple, undeniable fact of her humanity, her suffering. Martha would have approved. She had always been the one to see the person, not the circumstance. They ate at the small kitchen table, the silence now less awkward and more contemplative. She told him her name was Eleanor, and little else. He didn't press. He saw the way she held her spoon, with a delicacy that seemed at odds with her current state. He noticed the intelligence in her eyes when she listened, a quiet, observant quality that made him feel as though she was seeing more than just the surface of him and his home. After they finished, she insisted on washing the dishes, her movements careful and methodical. As he watched her, he felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. The house felt less empty, the silence less oppressive. For the first time in a long time, it felt like a home again, not just a collection of rooms and memories. Later that night, as he lay in his own bed, listening to the rain finally soften to a gentle patter against the roof, he felt a sliver of hope. Perhaps this small act of kindness was not just for her, but for him, too. A way to let a little light back into the quiet, lonely corners of his own life. The first few days settled into a rhythm of quiet coexistence. Eleanor moved through the house with a ghost-like grace. Her presence felt more in what she did than what she said. Arthur would wake to the scent of coffee already brewed and find the morning newspaper laid perfectly parallel to the edge of the kitchen table. He would return from work to find the living room dusted, the throw pillows on the sofa plumped, and a simple but nourishing dinner waiting on the stove. She never overstepped. She asked for nothing and offered a silent, diligent industry that began to slowly push back against the tide of neglect that had crept into the house since Martha's passing. It was a comfort, yet it was also unsettling. Her efficiency felt practiced. There was a precision in the way she folded laundry, a methodical approach to cleaning the windows that spoke not of desperation, but of discipline. One afternoon, Arthur found her in the hallway, staring at the grandfather clock that had stood silent for over a year. Its brass pendulum was still, its deep chime a long-forgotten memory. He had meant to call a repairman, but it was one of those tasks that was always relegated to a tomorrow that never came. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "It was my wife's," Arthur replied. "It stopped working last winter. I'm afraid the mechanism is quite complicated." Without asking for permission, she opened the tall glass door, her fingers tracing the intricate woodwork with a surprising familiarity. She gently reached inside, her touch feather-light on the brass weights and chains. With a delicate nudge to a small lever he had never noticed, there was a soft click, and the pendulum began to swing. A low, steady tick-tock filled the hall, a sound so familiar and yet so foreign that it made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. The heart of the house was beating again. He stared at her, a question forming on his lips. but she simply closed the clock's door and turned away, leaving him in the suddenly resonant silence. His neighbor, Mrs. Gable, chose that Saturday morning to make her inquiry. She appeared at his hedge as he was weeding Martha's neglected rose garden, her face a mask of feigned casualness. "Arthur, dear," she began, her voice carrying across the lawn, "I couldn't help but notice you have a visitor." Arthur straightened up, wiping his brow with the back of a gloved hand. He offered a polite, if weary, smile. "Just helping someone out, Carol. A woman who fell on hard times." Mrs. Gable's eyes narrowed slightly. "Of course you have a good heart. Too good, some might say. It's just, Bob and I saw a news report the other night. A terrible story. A group of con artists, you see. They have a woman pretend to be homeless to get inside a house, learn the owner's routine, and then, well, you can imagine." She let the implication hang in the air between them, thick and poisonous. "I'm sure it's nothing," she added quickly, "but one can't be too careful these days." And the seed of doubt, small and cold, was planted. Arthur thanked her for her concern, but as he watched her retreat to her own perfectly manicured lawn, the ticking of the clock from inside his house suddenly sounded less like a heartbeat and more like a countdown. The following week, determined to clear out the spare room that had become a repository for forgotten things, Arthur enlisted Eleanor's help. He expected the task to be laden with painful memories, but her quiet, unassuming presence made it bearable. They worked in comfortable silence, sorting through boxes of old books, clothing, and mismatched household items. It was Eleanor who found the small, leather-bound photo album tucked away at the bottom of a trunk filled with Martha's winter coats. It wasn't one of their main albums. It was a small, personal one he barely remembered. She sat back on her heels and opened it, her fingers gently turning the stiff pages. She paused on one particular photograph. It was a faded color print from what looked to be the late 1970s, showing a small boy of about 4 or 5 sitting on a park bench. He had a mop of unruly blonde hair and a serious expression, and he was holding a bright red toy truck. Arthur looked over her shoulder, a mild curiosity stirring. He did not recognize the boy. He watched as Eleanor's hand, almost unconsciously, rose to touch the image. Her fingers traced the outline of the boy's face, a gesture of such profound and quiet sorrow that it silenced the air in the room. Her composure, usually so impenetrable, seemed to crack for just a moment, revealing a chasm of grief beneath. Her breathing hitched almost imperceptibly. "Who is that?" Arthur asked gently, trying to place the child. Was he a distant nephew? The son of an old friend? Eleanor seemed to startle, as if pulled from a trance. She quickly closed the album, her face becoming a neutral mask once more. "I don't know," she said, her voice a little too steady. "He just reminds me of someone I used to know, sir." She placed the album on a stack of things to be kept and immediately turned her attention to another box. Her movements brisk and efficient, the moment of vulnerability gone as quickly as it had appeared. But Arthur couldn't shake the image from his mind, the unknown boy in the photograph, and the deep, inexplicable pain in the eyes of the woman who now lived under his roof. The doubt, once planted by Mrs. Gable, began to sprout in the fertile ground of Arthur's orderly mind. He found himself observing Eleanor, not as a benefactor watching over a guest, but as a quiet investigator in his own home. He catalogued the small inconsistencies, the details that didn't align with the narrative of a woman who had spent years on the streets. It was in the way she handled the fine china he brought down for a special dinner, her hand steady and accustomed to the delicate weight. It was in a passing comment she made about the quality of light in a Turner painting he had a print of in his study, a remark that spoke of an education her threadbare coat belied. These were small things, tiny fissures in the story of her life, but they began to accumulate, creating a web of subtle contradictions. The house was no longer just a sanctuary. It was becoming a stage for a play whose script he did not know. The true fracture in his trust occurred on a Tuesday evening. He had come home early, letting himself in through the back door to avoid tracking mud from the garden through the kitchen. He was moving quietly toward the study when he heard a soft, metallic click from inside. He froze, his hand hovering over the doorknob. The study was his private space, and inside it was a small, personal safe tucked away in the bottom of his bookshelf. It wasn't for anything of immense value, just some important documents, Martha's modest jewelry, and a few $100s in emergency cash. He rarely opened it. Peeking through the sliver of space where the door was ajar, he saw Eleanor kneeling in front of the bookshelf. Her back was to him, but he could see her hands deftly turning the combination dial. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. She turned it left, then right, then left again, with a fluid certainty that made his blood run cold. There was a final, soft thump as the heavy steel door unlatched. He should have confronted her, then and there. He should have demanded an explanation, his voice filled with the righteous anger of a man betrayed. But he remained frozen, hidden in the shadows of the hallway, a storm of confusion and fear teeming within him. He watched as she opened the small safe, but she didn't take anything. She simply looked inside for a long moment, her posture unreadable, before closing the door with the same quiet precision and spinning the dial to lock it once more. She rose to her feet and turned, and he quickly pulled back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He retreated to the kitchen, making enough noise to announce his arrival, his mind reeling. How could she possibly know the combination? It was a date, a birthday, a number that meant nothing to anyone but him and Martha. He had never told a soul. The logical part of his brain, the accountant's mind that dealt in facts and figures, screamed that he was being played for a fool. Mrs. Gable's words echoed in his ears. A woman pretends to be homeless to get inside a house. That night, over a dinner that tasted like ash in his mouth, he tried to probe her past, cloaking his interrogation in the guise of gentle conversation. "You never speak of your family, Eleanor," he began, trying to keep his tone light. "Was there anyone?" She looked up from her plate, her eyes holding that familiar, distant sadness. "There was," she said vaguely. "A long time ago. I was young. I came from a small town in the Midwest, a place where everyone knew everyone." She offered a skeletal story of a difficult upbringing and a series of bad choices that led her down a long, painful road. But the details were hazy, like a landscape seen through thick fog. When he asked for the name of the town, she hesitated for just a beat too long before naming a place he'd never heard of. Her answers were just plausible enough to be believable, but they lacked the specific, unprompted details that color real memories. They felt hollow, constructed. He lay awake for hours that night, the steady tick-tock of the grandfather clock no longer a comfort. It now seemed to mock him, each tick a reminder of her mysterious skill, each talk a question mark hanging in the silence of his home. The image of her hands on his safe was seared into his mind. He was caught in an agonizing limbo, torn between the compassionate man he had always been and the frightened, suspicious stranger he was becoming. The woman sleeping in the guest room down the hall was no longer just a person in need. She was an enigma, a puzzle whose pieces didn't fit. He felt a growing dread that solving it would mean dismantling the quiet peace she had brought into his life, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face the truth of who he had let through his front door. The warmth she had brought was now undeniably intertwined with a chilling, unspoken threat. Understood. The state of passive suspicion could not last. It was not in Arthur's nature. His entire life had been built on ledgers and balance sheets, on the principle that every column must add up, and every discrepancy must be resolved. Eleanor's presence in his home had become a profound imbalance, a debt of truth that was accruing interest in the form of sleepless nights and a constant, low-grade anxiety. He decided, with the reluctant resolve of a man about to cross a line from which he could not return, that he needed facts. The answers, he suspected, lay in the one possession she guarded so closely, the tattered canvas bag she kept on the floor by her bed, its broken zipper held fast by a knotted piece of twine. His opportunity came on a bright, cool afternoon. Eleanor had developed a routine of taking a long walk after lunch, a solitary 2-hour pilgrimage through the city's parks and quiet residential streets. Arthur watched from the living room window as her small figure disappeared around the corner, and then he moved. His heart beat a nervous, unfamiliar rhythm as he walked down the hall and pushed open the door to the guest room. The room was immaculate, the bed made with crisp, sharp corners. The bag sat in its usual spot, looking innocuous and pathetic. He knelt, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled with the rough twine. It came undone easily. He peeled back the top flap, his breath held tight in his chest, half expecting to find something that would confirm his darkest fears. Inside, the contents were sparse and heartbreakingly simple. There was a worn wool sweater, a half-used bar of soap wrapped in a washcloth, a dog-eared paperback novel, and a small tin containing a few buttons and a tarnished silver locket. It was the detritus of a life stripped down to its barest essentials. For a moment, a wave of shame washed over him. He was violating the privacy of a vulnerable woman, a guest in his home. He was about to close the bag, to retreat and accept the mystery, when his fingers brushed against a stiff, folded paper tucked into a tear in the bag's inner lining. It had been deliberately hidden. He carefully worked it free. It was thick, old paper, softened and creased with age, and covered in a protective layer of yellowed tape. He unfolded it under the light of the window. It was a birth certificate. The document was issued by the county clerk's office over 2 decades ago. The formal typed letters were faded, but still legible. Child's name, Thomas Mayhew. Date of birth, April 12, 1978. Mother's name, Eleanor Mayhew. The line for the father's name was blank. Arthur stared at the mother's name. Eleanor. It had to be her. A different last name. Her maiden name, perhaps. He felt a strange mix of vindication and deepening dread. This was a solid fact, a tangible piece of her past. This was the boy from the photograph, the one who reminded her of someone she used to know. He carefully folded the certificate, slipped it back into its hiding place, and retied the twine, making sure it looked exactly as he had found it. He left the room, the piece of paper now a burning secret in his mind. That evening, after Eleanor had retired to her room, Arthur retreated to his study. The accountant in him took over, methodical and determined. He sat in the glow of his computer monitor and began to search. He started with her name, Eleanor Mayhew, but the results were too broad, too generic. He then tried the boy's name, Thomas Mayhew, adding the city's name to the search query. He sifted through pages of irrelevant data until he adjusted the search parameters, narrowing the time frame to the years following the boy's birth. An article from the local newspaper's digital archives popped up, dated 21 years ago. The headline was stark and chilling. 4-year-old boy vanishes from city park. His blood ran cold. He clicked the link. The story was brief, a tragic footnote in the city's history. A young boy had disappeared from the playground at Oakwood Park during a busy spring afternoon. His mother, a young single woman, had reportedly turned away for only a moment. A massive search had yielded nothing. The police had suspected the mother, then a runaway father, but no evidence ever materialized. The case had eventually gone cold, leaving a permanent scar on the community's sense of safety. The article included a grainy black-and-white photo of the missing child. It was the same boy from the album, the same serious expression, the same unruly blonde hair. His name was listed in the article not as Thomas Mayhew, but as Thomas Pendleton. Arthur stared at the screen, his mind refusing to process the information. Pendleton. His own last name. It had to be a mistake, a grotesque coincidence. He frantically searched for more articles, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He found another, a follow-up piece from a week after the disappearance. It mentioned the mother, a distraught woman named Eleanor, who had recently been using her son's presumed father's last name. The father, the article noted, was a local man who had reportedly denied paternity and had no involvement in the child's life. Arthur felt the room begin to spin, the walls closing in. The tragedy he was uncovering was no longer a stranger's story. Somehow, inexplicably, it was his. The name pulsed on the screen, Thomas Pendleton. It was a phantom echo of his own identity, a grotesque impossibility. Arthur's mind, a place of logic and reason, rejected it outright. A clerical error, a common name. It had to be. But the photo of the boy, that serious 4-year-old face, was now superimposed in his memory over the image of Eleanor's hand, tracing its outline, her grief a tangible thing in the dusty attic room. The air in the study grew thin, suffocating. The calm, methodical search was over. A frantic, desperate need for the truth consumed him. He pushed back from his desk, the chair scraping harshly against the floor, and walked out of the study. His steps were heavy, each one a hammer blow against the silent floorboards. He did not hesitate at her door. He knocked, louder than he intended, a sharp, ragged sound in the dead of night. He heard a rustle from within, then the soft click of the bedside lamp. "Arthur?" Her voice was thick with sleep. "Is everything all right?" He pushed the door open. He was holding his laptop, the screen glowing, a beacon of accusation in the dim light. He didn't speak. He simply turned the screen toward her. Eleanor's eyes adjusted to the light, then focused on the newspaper article, on the headline, on the photograph. A sound escaped her, a sharp, wounded intake of breath, and every trace of color drained from her face. The mask of the quiet, grateful homeless woman disintegrated in an instant, leaving behind the raw, terrified face of a woman staring at a ghost. "Who is he?" Arthur's voice was a hoarse whisper, unrecognizable to his own ears. "Tell me who he is." She shook her head, a violent, desperate denial. "I don't know. Don't lie to me," he cut in, his voice cracking with a terrifying new energy. "Not anymore. His name is Pendleton. The article says his mother was named Eleanor. It says the father was a local man. Tell me the truth." He took a step closer, the laptop a wall between them. "Tell me!" The dam broke. A sob tore from Eleanor's chest, a sound of such profound, ancient agony that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. The story came tumbling out, not in a neat narrative, but in a torrent of fragmented, painful memories. "I never meant to keep it from you," she wept, her words choked and broken. "We were so young. It was just one summer, before Martha, before everything. When I found out, you were happy. You were building a life. I wouldn't ruin that for you. So I left. I just left." Arthur stood paralyzed, his mind struggling to connect her words to a distant, hazy memory from his early 20s. A brief, passionate affair with a quiet girl who worked at the town diner, a girl who had disappeared without a word. A girl named Eleanor Mayhew. "He looked like you," she continued, her gaze fixed on something far beyond the walls of the room. "Our son, Thomas. I gave him your name. I thought it was the only piece of you he would ever have." The pieces began to slam into place in Arthur's mind, each one a separate, brutal impact. The photograph in the album wasn't of a stranger's child. It was a picture of his son. The son he never knew he had. The grief was so sudden, so immense, it was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. He stumbled back, leaning against the doorframe for support. "The safe," he breathed, the words barely audible. "The combination." Eleanor flinched as if he had struck her. "His birthday," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "April 12th. I never forgot it. I saw the safe. I had to touch the numbers. I didn't take anything. I would never." The truth of it was blindingly clear. She hadn't been trying to rob him. She had been performing a secret, painful ritual, connecting with the only date that mattered in her shattered life. The bag she guarded so fiercely, it didn't hold stolen goods. It held the birth certificate, the only proof that their son, that his son, had ever existed. Her homelessness, her entire life for the past 2 decades. It wasn't a story of poverty. It was a prison sentence, a self-imposed exile fueled by a guilt so profound it had erased her own identity. She had run, not from the law or from poverty, but from the ghost of her son and the unbearable silence in the empty space he had left behind. He looked at her then, truly looked at her. He did not see a con artist or a thief. He saw the girl from the diner, aged by a grief he couldn't possibly fathom. He saw the mother of his child. And in that moment, his heart did not just crack, it shattered. It broke for the son he had never met, never held, never known. It broke for the 21 years of a life that had been stolen from him. And it broke for the woman standing before him, a woman who had carried this impossible burden alone, her entire existence a penance for one moment of distraction in a sunlit park. The empty, quiet house he had offered her as a sanctuary was, in fact, the one place in the world where her past could finally catch her. The truth was out, a raw and gaping wound in the center of the room, and the silence that followed was louder than any scream, of course. The sun rose, but its light brought no warmth. It only served to illuminate the wreckage of the night before. Arthur and Eleanor sat in the kitchen, the untouched cups of coffee between them growing cold. The truth, now spoken, occupied all the air in the house, a heavy, suffocating presence. There was no going back. The secret had been kept for more than 20 years, festering in the dark. Arthur knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that it could not remain a secret between the two of them. It was a part of his family's history, a phantom limb they never knew they were missing. It had to be brought into the light, no matter how harsh the glare. He picked up the phone and dialed his sister's number. "Catherine," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I need you to come over. Now. There's something you need to know." An hour later, his sister Catherine and her husband, Mark, were sitting stiffly on the living room sofa. Catherine was a woman who valued order and propriety above all else, and her sharp eyes darted from Arthur's pale, drawn face to the silent, disheveled woman sitting in the armchair by the window. Eleanor looked smaller than ever, a ghost haunting the edges of the room. Mark, a pragmatic man, simply looked uncomfortable, sensing he was an unwilling audience to a drama he didn't understand. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Arthur didn't waste time with pleasantries. He stood before them, a man on a precipice, and he told them everything. He told them of a summer before Martha, of a mistake, of a girl who disappeared. He told them of a son he never knew he had, and then, gesturing toward the woman in the chair, he told them the rest. The silence that followed his words was absolute, a vacuum of disbelief. Catherine stared, her mouth slightly agape. "A son?" she finally whispered, the words fragile. "You had a son." The disbelief quickly curdled into anger. Her gaze snapped to Eleanor, her expression hardening into one of pure contempt. "And you," she spat, her voice dripping with venom. "You're the mother? You're the one who lost him." Eleanor flinched, curling in on herself as if to absorb a physical blow. "It wasn't. I only turned away for a moment," she began, her voice a thread. "A moment?" Catherine shot back, her voice rising. A moment was all it took to lose a child. To erase a part of our family? And then what? You just vanished? You let everyone think he just ceased to exist. You abandoned him. The word hung in the air, a deliberate, cruel weapon. It struck its mark. Eleanor broke, her carefully constructed composure shattering. Yes, she cried out, the confession torn from her. Yes, I abandoned him. Not in the park, not then, but after. The looks, the whispers, the police looking at me like I was a monster, the pressure. I couldn't breathe. The guilt was eating me alive. So I ran. I left it all behind. I abandoned his memory. I abandoned hope. I abandoned everything. It was easier to be nothing than to be the mother of a lost boy. Catherine turned her fury back to Arthur. And you let this woman into your house? You gave her a bed? She is the reason your son is gone, Arthur. She is the reason for all of this pain. Mark put a placating hand on his wife's arm, but she shook it off. This was a violation of the highest order, an affront to the memory of their family, to the memory of Martha, to everything she held sacred. The anger was a cleansing fire, simplifying a truth that was too complex and painful to bear. In her eyes, Eleanor was a parasite, a villain who had returned to the scene of her crime. Arthur had been standing silently, absorbing the blows, the recriminations, the righteous anger that he knew he deserved. But as he watched his sister tear into the broken woman huddled in the chair, something shifted inside him. He looked at Eleanor, and he did not see the monster Catherine described. He saw a lifetime of suffering etched onto a human face. He saw a punishment far greater than any court of law could ever have delivered. And he finally understood. He stepped forward, positioning himself between his sister and Eleanor. "That's enough, Catherine." His voice was quiet, but it held a new, unbreakable firmness. This didn't start with her. It started with me, with a choice I made when I was a boy. I am as much a part of this story as she is. Catherine stared at him, aghast. "You're defending her?" "I'm not defending her actions," Arthur said, his gaze unwavering. "I am telling you that the anger you feel, I feel it too, but pointing it at her won't change anything. It won't bring him back." In that moment, facing his family's rage, he realized the truth he had been circling all morning. The forgiveness he was contemplating offering to Eleanor was not just for her. It was for him. He craved an end to the guilt, an absolution for his own youthful ignorance, and the secret he unknowingly kept. Condemning her was a life sentence for them both, chaining them to a ghost. Forgiveness was the only key. The visit ended badly. Catherine and Mark left in a storm of angry, unresolved emotions, leaving a chasm of silence in their wake. The public exposure was complete. The truth laid bare. Arthur and Eleanor were alone again, isolated in the wreckage. He looked over at her, not with anger, not with pity, but with the weary, sorrowful clarity of a man who finally understood the true depth of the tragedy that bound them together. The departure of his sister and her husband left a silence in the house that was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a truth fully told, a wound exposed to the air. For the rest of that day, Arthur and Eleanor moved through the rooms like two satellites orbiting a dead star, bound by the same tragic gravity, but never touching. The sick anger from the confrontation had evaporated, leaving behind the fine, gray ash of sorrow. Arthur spent the afternoon in the garden, tending to Martha's roses with a methodical slowness, his hands moving through the familiar motions, while his mind navigated a vast, uncharted territory of grief. He was grieving for a son whose laughter he had never heard, for a life he had never known he'd created, and for the man he might have been had he known the truth. He thought of the past 21 years. While he had been building a career, celebrating anniversaries with Martha, and settling into a comfortable, orderly life, Eleanor had been wandering in a wilderness of her own making, her only companion, the crushing weight of her guilt. He thought of her sleeping in doorways, clutching a worn bag that held the only proof of their shared history. He had faced his own loss when Martha died, but his grief was clean, socially acceptable, shared with friends and family. Eleanor's grief had been a solitary, shameful secret, a punishment she meted out to herself every single day. The anger he had felt, the sense of betrayal, the rage at the monumental deception, slowly dissolved, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. To condemn her now would be to add a single drop of water to an ocean of suffering. It would change nothing. It would heal nothing. Later that evening, he found her in the guest room. Her few meager possessions were placed neatly inside the tattered canvas bag, the knotted twine waiting beside it. She was preparing to leave, to disappear back into the shadows from which she had come. She looked up as he entered, her face pale but her expression resolved. There was no fight left in her, only a weary acceptance. "I'll be gone before morning," she said, her voice a near whisper. "You've been kind, Arthur. Kinder than I ever deserved. You and your family. You don't need this ghost in your lives." He stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the woman who was both a complete stranger and the most intimate connection to the greatest loss of his life. The thought of the house returning to its former silence, of him being truly alone again with this new, heavier grief, was unbearable. "This was his home," Arthur said quietly, the words feeling strange and momentous on his tongue. "He was a Pendleton. This house was his birthright, even if he never set foot in it." He took a step into the room. "You are his mother. You have carried him alone for all these years. You don't have to carry him alone anymore." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes clouded with confusion, not daring to hope. "Don't go," he said. It was not a command, but a plea. "Stay. This house has been empty for too long. Let's fill the silence together. For him." In that offer was the entirety of his decision. It was not a grand absolution, not a dramatic speech of forgiveness, but something far more meaningful. A quiet acceptance, a shared future. He was offering her a final resting place for her long and terrible journey, and in doing so, he was giving himself a reason to not retreat completely into the darkness that had descended. And so she stayed. Life settled into a new, quiet normal. The wounds were too deep to ever disappear, but they were no longer festering. They spoke of Thomas sometimes, in quiet, hesitant sentences, piecing together the 4 short years of his life from her fragmented, painful memories. Arthur learned about his son's love for red trucks, his serious disposition, his unruly blonde hair. They were ghosts, but they were their ghosts, and they no longer had to face them alone. One night, weeks later, Arthur lay in bed, the familiar silence of the house wrapped around him. He heard a floorboard creak downstairs, followed by the soft sound of footsteps in the kitchen. The sound, which had once filled him with a strange and unsettling feeling, now landed differently. It was not the sound of an intruder, of a secret. It was the sound of life. It was the sound of Eleanor, unable to sleep, brewing the chamomile tea that helped soothe her frayed nerves. It was the sound of the house breathing again. A quiet sense of peace settled over him, a peace he had not felt in years. His heart was broken. The truth had ensured it would never be truly whole again. But as he listened to the gentle, living sounds from the kitchen below, he realized that a broken heart, shared with another, could still find a way to be at peace.